Okay, second part of me talking you through the first chapter of Capital, Volume 1, in medias res. So the second section picks up, unsurprisingly, where the first section ended, namely with the concept of the twofold character of the labor that is contained in the commodities. So Marx argued that not only is there the twofold character of the commodity seen under the perspective of being a value and seen under the perspective of being a use value, but also there is the same duality of character in the labor that produces the commodity, namely labor seen under the perspective of producing value, and the same labor, of course, seen under the perspective of producing use values. And Marx is particularly pleased with that sort of extension of the double character of the commodities, saying here, as you can see, I was the first to point out and to examine critically this twofold nature of the labor contained in commodities. And he says this is the pivot on which a clear comprehension of political economy turns. That's why he is expanding on this particular aspect of what he basically has already stated in a shorter form in the first section. In the second section he goes into more detail about this particular aspect because it is of such crucial importance. This inevitably contains a certain amount of repetition, but as I said before, the repetition is your friend. It is good that there is repetition because this is something that is, on the one hand, this is all relatively easy, probably when you hear it for the first time, but it is uncannily tricky to actually get your head around. So to actually think in these categories is sort of, it's almost like learning a language perhaps. So it is something that you simply have to get used to doing, and reading the entire chapter and then obviously the entire volume of Capital, Volume 1 at least, is of course the appropriate way of doing this, simply also to benefit from the level of repetition that there is. Although there is much less repetition the further you go into the volume. It's only at the beginning that he's sort of circling around these several of these rather abstract key ideas, and I think he does that quite deliberately. So my feeling is that he senses that he's sort of approaching these key ideas several times from slightly different angles, basically to make them perhaps somewhat easier to understand. So the code is a use value that satisfies a particular want. The labor whose utility is represented by the value in use. Value in use is an old-fashioned, a slightly more old-fashioned English way of saying a use value. So represented by the use value of its product, or which manifests itself by making its product a use value, we call useful labor. So that is the one type of labor that we have here. The one concept, and then that is here further defined as productive activity of a definite kind. So it is a specific activity, an exercise with a definite aim. So the emphasis is here entirely the labor looked at under the perspective of producing a useful product is a specific and concrete and definite productive activity. That is the point that he's hammering home here. He mentions social division of labor, so obviously these specific activities emerge historically in the process, in the historical process of society, in the form of social division of labor that produces specific labors as special productive activities exercised with a definite aim. That's what he refers to as useful labor, of which he says here on the next page. I'm trying to speed up a little bit, otherwise this lecture will end up being more in the area of 5 hours or something. So I'm jumping over some bits and pieces of the text that you will have to read in your own time, obviously. So far, therefore, as labor is a creator of use value, so far as it is useful labor, so looked at under that perspective, it is a necessary condition, independent of all forms of society, for the existence of the human race. So all forms of human society will be based on some kind of useful activity. It is a necessary condition of human existence to do some kind of work. So the emphasis is always here on the specific form, because as you remember, Marx emphasizes very much that the analysis given here is that of the current type of society that we are living in, where all the things that are on the one hand generic and universal parts of human existence take specific forms that are characteristic of particular types of society only. And that is always the perspective under which Marx discusses pretty much anything, including, of course, work or labor. Now he moves on the next page here to the other side of the duality of the binomial, if you like, of use value and value. So far as they are values, these commodities, coat and linen, they are things of a like substance, objective expressions of essentially identical labor. So that is the sort of the definition of the value side of commodities. And you can see here's sort of a lot of heavy, quite philosophical, potentially problematic vocabulary in here, like substance. That is of course a philosophical term. It could also be a term taken from science, like from chemistry, which he uses sometimes for illustration, but I think it is here a philosophical or almost also a theological concept. So what is substance? He emphasizes that these forms are objective, so they are not just as it were construed in the mind of the individuals who take part in these societal processes, but they are somehow objective, so in the sense of opposite to the human individuals involved in these processes. So there's something facing us. That is what objective literally means. Objectum is something that is sitting opposite us. So they are an external reality in that sense, not totally different from how Durkheim would talk about social facts. So that is basically a quite similar idea here. Objective expressions of essentially identical labor. So you have the concept of essence, of identity, and obviously connected to the concept of labor here. So all these terms are brought together here to signify the opposite of what useful labor is, which is specific and individual and definite, whereas here this slightly mysterious substance of which commodities are objective expressions, that is essentially identical in all commodities. So that is the principal proposition, which is basically just recapping what was already said in the previous section. So here he's riffing on the same idea some more. A very famous sentence is this one: tailoring and weaving, though qualitatively different productive activities, concretely, specifically different, are each a productive expenditure of human brains, nerves and muscles, and in this sense are human labor. So this is an attempt to describe in sort of concrete sounding terms what this thing abstract labor, or labor seen in abstraction from its specificity, could mean. So labor is, irrespective of what particular form it takes, the expenditure of brains, nerves and muscles. Then he introduces the concept of simple average labor, because as you remember, the value is constituted not by the specific labor that is exerted on a particular commodity, but it reflects the societal average of labor that is needed in a specific societal historical context to produce a particular type of commodity. And this he picks up here with the concept of simple average labor, which varies in character in different countries and at different times. So it is again historically, societally specific, but in a particular society it is given. So that is basically here the proposition that you look at these processes in the context of particular societies, by which he by implication obviously means basically societies as defined by modern states, so countries basically, you could say, in this text at least. So we disregard the difference between the useful forms of labor, like weaving and tailoring, etc., to get to the concept of abstract labor. So tailoring and weaving are necessary factors in the creation of use values, coat and linen, precisely because these two kinds of labor are of different qualities. So the usefulness of a coat is produced by the specific, or is you could say results from the specific qualities of the labor process that produces them. So the usefulness does not result from this labor being labor in a very generic sense. So that means if you're a tailor and you make a coat, then the usefulness of that coat is not simply due to the fact that you expand brain, muscles and nerves, which would be if I try to make a coat, I will expand brain, muscles and nerves, but it will not be a very useful coat, because I'm not a tailor and I'm not even a part-time or hobby tailor. Whereas when somebody who knows how to do it does expand brains, muscles, nerves, then he or she will do that in a particular way, in a specific, concrete manner, and that's what actually makes it a useful product. That's what creates the use value. So only insofar as abstraction is made from their special qualities, only insofar as both possess the same quality of being human labor, do tailoring and weaving form the substance of the values of these same articles, irrespective of their specific characteristics. So he's hammering this home repeatedly here in this section, the difference between the generic and the specific aspects. Now we turn back here a bit further down in the text to the concept of wealth, which, as you might remember, is basically the very first word in the volume 1 of Capital, is wealth, indicating that wealth is really the object of this entire analysis. He says here, an increase in the quantity of use values is an increase of material wealth. So if you have more coats, then you are materially more wealthy than when you have fewer coats. So with 2 coats, 2 men can be clothed. With 1 coat, only 1 man. So that constitutes actual material wealth. Nevertheless, and this is now one of the tricky things about capitalism, an increased quantity of material wealth may correspond to a simultaneous fall in the magnitude of its value. Namely, when the production of 2 coats today requires less labor in the societal average than the production of perhaps only 1 coat 20 years ago. Because in the meantime perhaps somebody invented a machine or a labor process that increases the productivity again on the societal average in a particular society that you're looking at. In this case, in those, say, 20 years, wealth, or at least the potential of wealth creation, has increased, but the production of value, certainly with respect to the making of coats, would have halved. It would have decreased. And that indicates one of the principal problems, or perhaps the principal problem in the conception of capitalism, that capitalism is interested in the increase of value, because that is what capital results from. So capital is basically the accumulation of values, not the accumulation of material wealth. So the material wealth increases more or less accidentally in the process of trying to maximize the accumulation of value in the form of capital. That is what capitalism is all about, and this is one of the principal problems. So this is, I'm slightly anticipating here what is developed on the remaining 800 or so pages of the book. I just add this here to give you sort of an idea why we are sticking to these basic concepts in such a sort of for such a long period of time. So why he's going on and on about these concepts, because from them derives this more fundamental problem in the concrete reality of capitalist society. So once you have understood and sort of almost like how do you say, sort of absorbed the fundamental difference between the twofold character of the commodity and the twofold character of labor in capitalism, then all the other things sort of logically follow from there. So this argument about the disjuncture between the disconnect, or at least the possible disconnect between the creation of material wealth and the creation of value, is hinted at in this sentence here. However, then, productive power may vary. The same labor exercised during equal periods of time always yields equal amounts of value. But it will yield, during equal periods of time, different quantities of values in use, different quantities of use values, and that depends on the productive power. So the material wealth produced depends on the productivity, whereas the value produced, and this is what capitalism as a system is interested in to maximize, will not necessarily rise, might actually even diminish. So the increase in productivity might actually make the reproduction of capital more difficult, although at the same time it might increase the production of wealth, up to a point where there might even be too much wealth, or too much wealth in one particular form. Maybe there are too many coats and not enough medicines, or whatever else, which is sort of the source of many of the things that people discussing the realities of capitalist societies as complex systems, very different from this extremely abstract level that we are looking at here in the first chapter of Capital, or in the first volume of Capital, in fact, would typically focus on. So this is what sort of the significance of all this is. So, and that is basically the second section. This is what the second section. This is the way the second section picks up some aspects from the first section and develops them somewhat further. Now, the third section of the first chapter is much longer and contains longer passages that are rather technical, which I will jump over. So I'm now trying to jump from in between several of the key passages. So the first few pages of the third section are extremely interesting. So we will probably spend a little bit of time on simply the first pages now. Just one thing here, you see this is one of the footnotes here. That's still a footnote to the end of the second section here. Many interesting things happen in the footnotes. Here's a footnote that was added by Engels, in fact. You can see here at the end the ad for editor, that is actually Friedrich Engels here. A very interesting footnote that clarifies a particular detail. Engels writes here, the English language has the advantage of possessing different words for the two aspects of labor here considered. The labor which creates use value, so the concrete labor and counts qualitatively, is work, as distinguished from labor. That which creates value and counts quantitatively is labor, as distinguished from work. So the English language, and that has to do with the history of the English language, which has Germanic roots. So work is a Germanic root, and labor is a Latin root. So English, in many cases, has the English language has so many words, so much vocabulary, partly because it absorbed Germanic as well as Romance roots. They're often both present, and as it happens in languages, when you have two words that basically mean the same thing, like work and labor, then the language, or the society that uses the language, in reality, of course, develops or looks for different meanings and attributes these two words to different, slightly differentiated sets of meanings, and this is what happened here. So labor is slightly different from work. Referring basically, at least from the perspective that Engels is indicating here, labor refers to capitalist work, capitalist labor, whereas the word work refers to productive activity in a much more generic sense. So when we discuss labor or work in the context of capitalism, you would typically talk about labor. If you discuss work in a more generic sense, or in other historical contexts, you would probably be more likely to use the word work. Which is interesting because if you look at the etymology, the literal meaning, or the origin of the word labor comes from, or the Latin root of the word labor actually means suffering, which is kind of nice. It is sort of a interesting. It gives sort of like a subtext to the word, a kind of a connotation to the word. So the language has chosen a word that literally means suffering to designate labor or work in capitalism. Modern work is suffering, whereas work in general is not necessarily suffering. So it probably in reality has always been most of the time, but work could also be looked at as something maybe even, well, not exactly enjoyable, but at least something not entirely negative. So it is a more open concept, perhaps. So work is a more open and generic concept as opposed to labor, which is more specific and has much more a subtext of basically something you're forced to do, because obviously labor in capitalism is something you have to do simply to reproduce yourself, which work is too, but the meaning of the word is slightly more open. So this is what this footnote by Engels here is pointing at. So where are we? Section 3. Okay. So commodities are use values again. So you can sing this now. Being use values is their plain, homely, bodily form. It's kind of especially here, actually, in these passages in the third section, Marx begins to employ slightly more flowery and sort of more rhetorical language. So it's quite interesting. The text shifts in between being on the one hand sometimes very analytical and very sort of almost technical, or in some passages rather technical, and then there are other passages that are much more rhetorical, that are almost like literature, up to the point when it actually can become rather poetic. And then obviously there are all these sarcastic and rather mean passages where he's basically taking the Mickey out of either other people or also groups of people, of which we will get a few examples in a minute. So they are, however, commodities only because they are something twofold. So again, recapping the argument so far: objects of utility on the one hand, depositories of value on the other hand. So they have these two forms: a physical or natural form and a value form. So you notice that the word value is used, the word form is used a lot in Marx's text. So that is quite important to keep in mind, because the word form indicates we are always talking about the historically specific form of something that in itself might not be so historically specific, such as labor being the capitalist form of work, if you like. So it is at the same time specific, but also a specific form of something that is much more generic. So now I inserted here some comments. Oh yes, this is the one of the strange formulations. It's quite typical of Marx. The reality of the value of commodities differs in this respect from Dame Quickly, that we don't know where to have it. So you will certainly not understand at all what this means unless you happen to know that Dame Quickly is a character in Shakespeare, in some of Shakespeare's plays, in the Henry plays exactly. So she is in these plays. Marx uses lots of references to Shakespeare. So Marx was a huge fan of Shakespeare, and Shakespeare references are all over the book. All the time you have to look out for these Shakespeare references. So Dame Quickly is a pub landlady, and is presented in Shakespeare's text as a somewhat dubious, ambiguous figure. So a woman who is on the one hand connected to slightly criminal sort of substratum of society. There are some connections to prostitution as well. At the same time, she's trying to be a respectable woman as the pub landlady. So Dame Quickly basically is here sort of a stand-in for ambiguity. And here is one case where the translation is a little bit unclear, so where it says where to have it, actually that should be where to have her, because that is the reference from Shakespeare. And so my note here that I've written to myself, the value form of the commodity, that's what is here translated somewhat misleadingly the reality of the value of commodities. Actually, this should be the value form of the commodity differs from Dame Quickly, which stands in for ambiguity, is different from Dame Quickly, which means that the value form of the commodity is unambiguously spiritual, not at all coarse and material. Right? So the joke here is that Dame Quickly is at the same time coarse and material as the pub landlady, but she wants to be spiritual and respectable. Whereas the value side of the commodity is not ambiguous at all. It is unambiguously spiritual and not material. That is the slightly strange formulation here. This theme continues a bit, so he says here the value of commodities has a purely social reality. So this is an entirely social concept. Again, very similar to Durkheim's concept of the social fact, that's what value is, and not an ounce of material reality goes into it. So it is entirely something constituted by society itself. Value can only manifest itself in the social relation of commodity to commodity. So it is a relational concept. Value is basically the expression of a relationship between commodities, which in themselves are also social facts. So society is everywhere in here. So all these things are categories of society. And now he engages, and that is what the third section is basically about. It is basically introducing a kind of a very basic theory of what money is. So everyone knows money. And that is obviously, what he means by that is that the empirical experience that everybody has of capitalist society is the handling of money. That is how we all sort of sensually experience the reality of capitalist society. We do not sensuously experience value. You can't, because it's an abstract concept. But you do experience money. That's actually you have in your pocket, and that's you're using every day for practically everything. So that's what he's referring to here. Everybody knows money. Nobody knows the value theory or the labor theory of value that he's discussing here. But actually money is a form, again the word form here, derived from the concept of value. And the entire this entire chapter is basically trying to do exactly this, to build up from the very basic abstract category the more concrete and specific and more experiential category of money. That's where he will end up at the end of the third section, the section we are discussing here at the moment, with the concept of money. And this is basically, he's indicating here, this is the task he's setting himself here, the tracing the genesis of this money form, developing the expression of value in the form of money. So money is the expression of that much more abstract thing, or rather not a thing at all, called value, which is a relational category. So again, back to the linen and the coat. The linen expresses its value in the coat, which means that the coat serves as the material in which that value is expressed. So that's basically restating again what we already had in the first and second sections. Obviously, it is a very simple point, and it is at the same time a very strange point. If it is simple as long as you don't think much about it, like probably many other things as well. And as soon as you write them down in this abstract and theoretical manner, they become very strange. So it is simple. The simple point is that you cannot express the exchange value of a coat in coats, in units of coats. You cannot say one coat is worth one coat, Obviously, you can say that, but it is stupid. It makes no sense at all. When you can say one coat is worth 20 meters of linen, that sort of makes sense. At least if you're a tailor, probably that makes sense, because it gives you an indication of the relative value of these two different material things. That is what is meant, that the linen expresses its value in the coat. So the coat is obviously itself a material thing and a use value. So the second use value becomes an embodiment or a representation, almost like a symbol, or we are almost entering semiotics here, or a lot of this, especially on this and the next few pages, sort of anticipates arguments that you probably know from linguistics or semiotics, because one thing becomes a representative of another thing. So it becomes to mean that other thing, which is a extremely interesting line of thought. So the value comes to represent the coat, which is an actual thing, comes to represent the value of that other thing, linen. And that is because they are both have a secret essence, which is of course congealed labor, or dead labor, basically. That's the main argument here. And you can sort of sense, as you already learned, that the argument here in the third section runs towards the concept of money, that you have here a sort of primitive form of money in the form of the coat. So the coat is a sort of something similar to money in relation to the linen, because the coat represents the value of that first commodity. That's sort of that's in a nutshell the argument here in these few paragraphs. So I'm jumping over some stuff here. Another theoretical point here, the magnitudes of different things, magnitudes meaning magnitudes, the size or the weight or whatever of different things, can be compared quantitatively only when those magnitudes are expressed in terms of the same unit, right? So if you want to compare quantitatively a distance, then you need to have a unit that can be applied to both of the distances that you want to measure. So when you say my baguette is 3 foot long, whereas the other baguette is only 1 foot long, then that makes sense only because the unit of measurement, the foot in this case, is the same. If they weren't the same, then the statement wouldn't make much sense. So if you compare things quantitatively, you need to have a third thing in which you measure those quantities. That is just sort of a background comment here about this third thing, which is obviously, as you remember from the first section perhaps, time, which is the measurement of exerted, or is the measurement of labor when it is, or after it is being exerted. And that is basically how you compare magnitudes of value. So here's now an illustration from chemistry, which we jump over. This is only helpful if you are familiar with chemistry, which probably most of us are not, I guess. Here again, restate by making the coat the equivalent of the linen, equivalent by putting an equivalence sign between them in the equation that you have seen on the page before. We equate the labor embodied in the former to that in the latter. So this labor is embodied in there. Embodied meaning, of course, also that this labor is already exerted. So we're talking not about the living labor that is in the process of being exerted, but we're talking about basically dead labor, labor that is congealed, that is crystallized in the product of that labor. This is what all this is about. It is the expression of equivalence between different sorts of commodities. Again, there's sort of recapping again, based on the common quality of human labor in the abstract. So we discussed the concept of abstract labor already before. Now here again for clarification, human labor power in motion, or human labor. So we have here the distinction, very important in Marx, but this becomes important later on in the text, between labor power and labor. So labor power is that which we sell in the process of, or in the form of the wage labor relationship. So if I'm a wage laborer, then I'm not selling my labor, I'm selling my labor power. So for example, if, say, you are a factory worker, you are sitting there, you are 8 or 10 or 12 hours or whatever it may be, you have sold your labor power. But if then, as is sometimes the case, there is no material to do anything, maybe you're just sitting around, but you're still selling your labor power, although you're actually not doing anything. That would be a rather sort of lucky example. I don't know why this now comes to my mind, maybe to do with the virus and so on. So selling labor power is different from selling labor. So labor is labor power in motion, or the exertion of the labor power. So that is what living labor is, or labor as a process. Labor, in that sense, the exertion of labor power, creates value but is not itself value. It becomes value only in its congealed state, so after it's exerted, basically. Basically the dead labor. Here I made here a note. What was the note? Yeah, dead. So congealed, basically you could translate as dead labor, or frozen, or crystallized labor. So the labor, living labor, is crystallized in the form of the product. Form again. So you see the word form is ubiquitous here in Marx's argument. So the code itself, the body of the commodity. Yeah, so Marx thinks of the value as the soul of the commodity. So again, he's quite. I think most of these things are sort of playful and almost somewhat tongue-in-cheek when he talks, when he uses these very heavy philosophical and sometimes even theological concepts. There's always an element of him having a laugh in there, although they're at the same time serious, because he does actually use these philosophical concepts. But sometimes they're so heavy and they're deliberately used in a sort of very mundane context that there is this element of playfulness in there. So when he talks about the soul, value being the soul of the commodity, and the use value being the body of the commodity. So this is ongoing. So he does that throughout the book again and again. So it's kind of like a running joke in a sense. So this shows that when placed in the value relation to the linen, the code signifies more than when out of that relation. So the code as such, if you look at the code, perhaps if you look at it outside societal relationships, or outside the relationship of capitalist production in particular, then a code is just a code. It's a useful thing. Within the societal relationships, so looked at under the perspective of society, and in particular capitalist society, the code in this particular example, when it is put in relation to the linen, becomes a signifier of something else, which is the value of the linen. So you see again here sort of the an almost sort of is a semiotic kind of argument sneaking in here, sort of between the lines. in this sort of playful manner. So the code is the depository of value, but it does not actually show this. So you cannot see, when you just see the code, you cannot see that it is the depository of value. You need to put it in relation to other commodities, and then you can see what it actually essentially is. So you can see the soul of the commodity only in the body of another commodity. And that is because this soul is essentially relational, and it only appears, it becomes visible when it is put in relation to something else. That is the basic idea here. You see, the whole argument is very much, well, sociological, although the word hardly existed at the time, and Marx certainly would not have used this kind of word. It's an anachronism to call it that, but it is, in a sense. It is a very society-centered argument, is perhaps a more accurate way of describing this. And now he uses a few examples which are quite funny, some of them, and maybe quite illustrative and maybe more useful than the earlier example from chemistry, which we didn't look at. He says here, person A, for instance, cannot be Your Majesty to person B unless at the same time Majesty in the eyes of person B assumes the bodily form of person A. And what is more, with every new father of the people, meaning king, changes its features, hair and many other things besides. So that's a bit, probably a bit strange to understand instantly. It means something like this. Person B thinks of person A, which is king or queen, as majesty, but only because in the mind of this person B, the concept of majesty, which is an abstract concept, so you cannot see majesty. Majesty is not a material thing, it's a concept, it's a philosophical, theological concept. But in the mind of this person B, it assumes the bodily form of A. It looks like A, say the queen. And with every new father of the people, or mother of the people in our case here, with every new king or queen or whatever, the image that person B, which is basically the citizens, have of the concept of majesty changes its features, so it takes on a new look. So basically this means that with abstract concepts like that we have, or most people in society have, a particular image. So when we say majesty as British subjects of the Queen, we think of the image of the Queen that represents or symbolizes majesty, if you like. And it is similar with the commodities. So that is what this is meant to illustrate. In the same way that the particular person, the Queen, symbolizes majesty in the eyes of her subjects. The coat, in the previous example, symbolizes value in the eye of the linen, if you like. So the linen, and also everybody else, sees in the coat the soul, the value of this commodity linen. That is what the example here is meant to illustrate. A value is, as value, the linen is the same as the coat, because the coat is representing the value of that linen, and also the quantity of that value, the magnitude of that value. In that sense, they are the same. So, thus, the linen acquires a value form different from its physical form. So the linen has basically two bodies. Again, that is a concept that is almost theological and has to do, you might be familiar with the concept of the two bodies of the king. So that's why Marx is kind of riffing on these sort of analogies, because they are actually quite similar. So you have in these philosophical concepts, the patterns of thought are actually quite similar to those you find in political economy. So you have the commodity has two bodies. It has its natural body and it has its value body, which is that other commodity. Again, keep in the back of the mind that we are here slowly inching towards the concept of money. So that other commodity stands in, so that the code stands in here basically for money, which comes like 10-15 pages down from here. But this is what we are moving towards. So the fact that it is value is made manifest by its equality with the code, just as, and this is very funny, unless maybe you don't find it funny, just as the sheep's nature of a Christian is shown in his resemblance to the Lamb of God. So one of many cases where Marx is taking the mickey out of Christians, one of his favorite things, but he takes the mickey out of many other groups as well. So he's quite unbiased in being sarcastic and mean to all kinds of individuals and groups of people. So what note did I make here? Well, yes. The sheep obviously is a symbol of Christ, and Marx is here saying that if Christ is sort of representative of the soul of a Christian, then the using the symbol of the lamb sort of represents the actual sheep-like quality of the soul of the individual Christians. So in the same sense, and that's the equality that is implied by the symbolism, by the relationship of representation that is implied here. So in a sense, the codeness of the value of the linen refers to the equality of the substance that makes these two things commodities, which again, as you hopefully remembered by this, because Marx has repeated this now for the 10th time, is congealed labor. So in the same sense, sheepishness is the shared essence between the Christian and the symbol that represents Christianity, the lamb. Okay, so this is kind of you have a lot of this kind of sarcastic, polemical stuff in Marx's writing, which is one of the sort of things that makes it very different from your regular academic philosophical text, and certainly very different from a social science sort of text, this kind of switching between different registers, different modes of writing. Now he talks even of a language of commodities, which again sounds strangely almost like sort of structuralist, or almost like a postmodern sort of joke, so that the commodities have their own language in which they kind of talk to each other, and they're familiar with each other, and so on, and that so they communicate with each other. So these commodities, which is again somewhat tongue-in-cheek, because obviously Marx would not literally suggest that the commodities themselves communicate. So he's kind of riffing on the sort of appearance of a sort of independent, systematic nature of the relationships between the commodities in capitalist society. So now we're jumping a little bit, and now another footnote, which is again hilarious, and another sort of sarcastic set of sarcastic comments. In a sort of way, it is with man here meaning human being, as with commodities. So that in itself is quite funny, because he's basically saying, oh, we are like the commodities. Obviously, literally or seriously speaking, if it was not slightly tongue-in-cheek, you would obviously rather say that commodities are like the societies humans create. But here he's saying, oh, human beings are like commodities. So since humans come into the world neither with a looking glass in their hand, nor as a Fichtean philosopher, to whom I sufficient, a man first sees and recognizes himself in other men, in other human beings. So you can recognize here one of the concepts of classical sociological theory. You might have heard about the theory of the looking glass self by Cooley, a hugely important American sociologist who was writing around 1900. So there's the book in which he described the looking glass self theory was published in 1902. And here it is. So Marx does formulates this idea in a footnote, sort of en passant, something that other people would make much later an entire book out of. So he's saying basically, as humans, we don't come into the world with an understanding of our identity, and we are not born as Fichtean philosophers. So Fichte is a post-Kantian philosopher who is chiefly associated with the idea of identity. So that is a joke that only philosophers can understand. This doesn't need to bother us. But the point here is that a child, or human beings in their early age, develop a sense of who they are, a sense of identity, as the modern term would be, by recognizing themselves in other human beings. And Marx continues, Peter only establishes his own identity as a human being by first comparing himself with Paul as being of like kind, as being similar. And thereby Paul, just as he stands in his Pauline personality, becomes to Peter the type of the genus homo, of the human genus, the human race, basically. So that is the same the same argument he made a few pages before about the majesty thing, and there's another iteration of this joke, or of this idea a bit further down. Peter sees Paul, so obviously that he uses these the names of the apostles as representing humanity, which again in itself is a sarcastic sort of joke, as if these Christian names are the first thing you would go to when you want to represent just human beings in general. Peter and Paul, okay. So Peter sees Paul, recognizes himself as a human being in the perception of Paul. So Paul being sort of the mirror in which you are recognizing your own humanity, if you like. And that's because we are not born with an actual mirror, so we don't have a mirror. You might also know this notion obviously from psychoanalysis, from post-Freudian psychoanalysis, the idea that small children go through exactly this identity forming process with the help of an actual mirror. So here it is another human being that is the mirror. And obviously this means that when Peter recognizes himself in Paul, then Paul, who just happens to be Paul, represents for Peter basically what it means to be human. So Paul becomes the type of the human race for Peter in the process of Peter's finding his identity as a human being. So that is the little footnote here. quite a footnote, I think. So this is great stuff. Now we jump over quite a bit here, further down we're still in the third section. Another illustration which I quite like, going back to the first section, you might remember the use of the geometrical figure of the triangle, and how triangles in geometry are used to calculate the area of rectangular figures. This kind of thing. Here is another example that is perhaps better as an illustration even, or it does the same job. There's no harm in having another example for this kind of stuff. Basically an illustration again of the process of abstraction that is involved here. It goes like this: a sugar loaf, being a body, is heavy and therefore has weight, but we can neither see nor touch this weight. So weight in that sense is an abstraction, is an abstract characteristic of this thing, although it is also a physical characteristic. We then take various pieces of iron whose weight has been determined beforehand. The iron as iron is no more the form of manifestation of weight than is the sugar loaf. So also the iron is a thing of whose weight is sort of an abstraction from the actual thing. Nevertheless, in order to express the sugar loaf as so much weight, we put it into a weight relation with the iron, because they can both be measured with the same measurement. In this relation, the iron officiates, it does the job of being a body representing nothing but weight. Although actually iron obviously has many other qualities. But when iron officiates as simply representing weight, all other qualities of iron are abstracted. So we abstract from all qualities that iron has except the one quality which is having weight. That makes it a weight measure, basically. And that is a process of abstraction. So we abstract most characteristics except the one that we're after. A certain quantity of iron therefore serves as the measure of the weight of the sugar, and represents in relation to the sugar loaf weight embodied in the form of manifestation of weight. So again, a concrete thing, a piece of iron, which has lots and lots of determinations, is looked at in abstraction of most of these characteristics, and thereby becomes simply a manifestation, a representation of weight in general. That is the example with the sugar loaf, which is quite useful, I think. Then this goes on a bit further, and then he says, here, however, the analogy ceases. The analogy ends here. The iron, in the expression of the weight of the sugar loaf, represents a natural property common to both bodies, namely their weight. But the coat, in the expression of value of the linen, represents a non-natural property of both, something purely social, namely their value. That is, again, the point that value is an entirely societal category and not a natural characteristic, because the weight, although the weight of the piece of iron is somewhat abstract, it's still a natural characteristic of iron, because iron actually has physically and naturally weight, whereas a commodity is a commodity only thanks to its being part of a societal relationship, a constellation of societal relationships. So again, this point which we have encountered repeatedly so far. Here another footnote that's sort of in a different iteration of an idea we have already discussed, but it's a really good one. One man is king only because other men stand in the relation of subjects to him. They, on the contrary, imagine that they are subjects because he is king. So this is similar to the earlier idea of the majesty being represented by this particular person, so as in the two bodies of the king idea. Here it's a slightly different take on a sort of similar concept. The king is only king, or in our case the queen is only queen, only as long as we act as if she was queen. So if everybody in society stopped acting as if the queen was the queen wouldn't be the queen anymore. So in that sense, the concept of queen or king is entirely constituted by society and by the actual behaviors and relationships of people in society. So we act as if she was queen, and that's why she is queen. What we think, however, and here it says they, so people in society, imagine that they are subjects because the king is the king. So that's what we think. So there is a disjuncture here between what actually happens and what we think what happens. So we imagine that we are subjects of the king because the king is the king. And that's probably one of the reasons that we do that, is that when we are born, the king, at least maybe not the specific king, but the majesty, so the institution of king, is already there. So we are born into this relationship, so we kind of wrongly perhaps assume that it is a natural relationship, when actually it is a relationship that needs, by repetition, by performance, if you like. So this idea is very similar to again, more contemporary social theory that talks about performativity and so on. The queen is only queen because we actually perform the queen. This is similar to a saying that actors use in a play, in the theater. The king is always played by the other actors. So to make clear, so if you're on stage, you wouldn't necessarily even need the king to wear a crown and other things. It should actually, if the acting is good, it should become clear from the acting of the other actors who the king is, even without actually having the specific props, etc. So that is the idea here, which again is quite a footnote, I think. Basically anticipating the concept that comes in the fourth section, the fetishism. So that is exactly here the concept of fetishism anticipated in this little illustration in this footnote here. So the fetishism being that the queen, actually quite similar to an actual fetish, which is of course again a sort of a theological concept describing particular types of religion or quasi-religion. We imagine that the queen or the king has in herself or himself particular powers, when actually these powers are only given to this person by the acting, the behavior, if you like, the performance of everybody else. But everybody else thinks that these powers are inherent in the king or the queen. That is the concept that Marx later in the next section will refer to as fetishism. Probably the most famous concept in this section. now, and we are almost coming to the end of the third section here, I want to pick out one more paragraph which I find extremely interesting. He goes now to one of the classic philosophers. He says, let's go back to the great thinker who was the first to analyze so many forms, again forms here, forms of thought, forms of society and forms of nature, and amongst them also the form of value, which is Aristotle, the classical Greek philosopher. So Aristotle actually describes something that comes relatively close to the modern theory of value, and almost quite close to the theory of money, or the concept of money. So this is the passage that Marx refers to here. Aristotle describes that in Athenian society of his time, you could there's a form of exchange economy taking place, whereby 5 beds equal 1 house. And he actually discovers, or Aristotle states actually, that the concept of money, which as it exists in Athenian society, is the same as the exchange relationship between 5 beds equals 1 house, only in the form of 5 beds equals so much money, which in turn equals 1 house. Now, apart from the fact that we can see here that furniture seemed to have been extremely expensive in classical Greek society. Obviously they didn't have IKEA and other industrial forms of furniture making, or maybe just houses were extremely cheap, I don't know. But that's not the point here. So the interesting thing that Marx picks up from Aristotle is that he is able to describe, at the level of description in his society, this equalization process, and he basically understands the concept of money up to this point. But then he says exchange, and he understands the process of equalizing between these things, and he finds, Aristotle points out that this is rather strange, that 5 beds are equal to 1 house, because beds and houses are totally different things. So that's the point Aristotle makes, and then he concludes here: exchange cannot take place without equality. So exchange is based on this concept of equality between these different things. And equality not without commensurability. So these things must be commensurate somehow. But Aristotle knows that furniture and houses are not commensurate. Or he thinks his objection to his own observation is that there is actually no commensurability. And then he says, well, basically this is impossible. So it's illogical to Aristotle that such unlike things can be commensurable and can be exchanged in terms of the exchange of equivalents, which he observes. So he sees, he describes that these things are exchanged as equal amounts of something, but then he says this doesn't make any sense, and he says, oh well, it's just a makeshift for practical purposes. So he's basically cutting short, or he's kind of devaluing his own observation there and saying, oh well, it is just a sort of an arrangement for practical purposes. So it's just convention basically. So it kind of stops just short of understanding what is going on in the exchange process. And that is remarkable. On the one hand, the remarkable thing is that Aristotle is able to discern this, so he actually observes this, which is amazing if you consider that money only existed 200-300 years at the time when he's kind of writing about it in this way. But it is also remarkable that he does not understand, or that he does not manage to continue to the point of actually understanding what is behind that. And this is obviously, in a sense, this passage from Aristotle is the starting point where Marx at the beginning of the text starts out from. You remember at the beginning he sets himself the task to explain the mystery behind money. So he basically trying to make that step that Aristotle was not able to make. Now, even more interesting, even more remarkable is the next passage where Marx is trying to explain why Aristotle was not able to make that particular step. And that is worth reading. This passage is worth reading in its entirety. It goes like this. What is that equal something, that common substance which admits of the value of the beds being expressed by a house? Such a thing in truth cannot exist, says Aristotle. And why not? Compared with the beds, the house does represent something equal to them, insofar as it represents what is really equal, both in the beds and the house, and that is human labor. There was, however, an important fact which prevented Aristotle from seeing that. To attribute value to commodities is merely a mode of expressing all labor as equal human labor, and consequently as labor of equal quality. And now comes the killer argument here. Greek society was founded upon slavery, and had therefore for its natural basis the inequality of men and of their labor powers. The secret of the expression of value, namely that all kinds of labor are equal and equivalent, because, and so far as they are human labor in general, cannot be deciphered until the notion of human equality has already acquired the fixity of a popular prejudice. Prejudice here meaning a popular conception. This, however, is possible only in a society in which the great mass of the produce of labor takes the form of commodities, in which consequently the dominant relation between man and man, or between human beings, is that of owners of commodities. The brilliancy of Aristotle's genius is shown by this alone, that he discovered in the expression of the value of commodities a relation of equality. The peculiar conditions of the society in which he lived alone prevented him from discovering what, in truth, was at the bottom of this equality. So, what Marx does here is he acknowledges that Aristotle 2,400 years ago was able almost to grasp what Marx is trying to grasp here in this text. He acknowledges that, and then he finds an explanation, a sociological, historical explanation for why Aristotle failed or was not able to grasp exactly this. And by implication also gives an explanation of why Marx, different from Aristotle, is able to discover the secret of value and money, because he lives and we live in a society that allows that discovery to be made, because it is a society that regularly, every single moment of the day, practically equates different kinds of labor as being fundamentally and sort of spiritually equal. So the idea of equality of labor in the abstract is written into every single exchange act in a commodity producing society, or to be more precise, in a society where the great mass of production is conducted in the form of commodity production. That is the decisive thing. So not just that there is a little bit of commodity production on the side, but that the great mass of everything that happens in the society takes place in that particular form. And because we live in that society, we are able to discover this. So in a sense, it was not Aristotle's fault not to discover the secret, because he just couldn't, because it was not the type of society that he didn't live in, the type of society that would have allowed him to make the discovery. And by analogy, it is not the great genius of Marx or anyone else to actually make the discovery, but it is basically the society that allows someone to make this discovery or to find this explanation in the theoretical connection. That is this passage on Aristotle, which is sort of implicitly a very important methodological reflection. So it is a reflection on the process of how science actually works. So it is again entirely a sociological argument. It is society in a particular historical constellation, context, situation that allows someone, obviously after a significant amount of studying, to make particular theoretical statements or discoveries, if you like. So that brings us nearly to the end of the third section. Let's see how much I think we can pretty much jump over most of this. This is kind of recap of most of that, except for this, which is the next step in the argument, called the total or the expanded form of value. This simply means that in society, when society is more complex, or if we look at society in its actual complexity, we have not just linen being expressed in the form of coats, but we have linen expressed in coats, expressed in tea, tea expressed in coffee, coffee expressed in corn, corn expressed in gold, gold expressed in iron, etc., etc. So we have these long chains of equations. That's what actually happens in these sort of, if you like, the network, or the network of chains of exchange relationships. So you have countless acts of equation of all these different things, all equating equal amounts of value. That is what Marx calls the expanded relative form of value. And you can kind of sense that we are moving now very close to the concept of money. So we're almost here at the concept of money. Marx says the value of a single commodity, the linen, for example, is now expressed in terms of numberless other elements of the world of commodities. Every other commodity becomes a mirror of the linen's value. So if you have these developed networks of exchange relations, you can express, and everything in society has become a commodity. That is the important point here. All these things that are listed, at least, linen, coats, tea, coffee, corn, gold, iron, etc., etc., they're all commodities. That means all these things, once they are citizens of the world of commodities, they can express each other's value in each other's relative value form. That is the argument here in this section, and behind this is that there are all constellations of undifferentiated human labor in the abstract labor. And that is nearly the end of the third section here. I'm not sure whether we need to look at anything else here. The expanded form of value comes into actual existence for the first time so soon as a particular product of labor, such as cattle, is no longer exceptionally but habitually exchanged for various other commodities. So that is the important historical step, the historical change that leads then finally to the invention or the constitution of money. It simply becomes habitual that one particular commodity is usually used as the universal equivalent, and that might in some situation, in some society, that might have been cattle. Probably he chooses cattle because, as you maybe know, the Latin word for money, pecunia, is derived from the word pecus, which means cattle. So that is sort of a reflection of the fact that at some stage in early Roman history, cattle seems to have had the function of money, basically. So cattle was money, hence the word for money being derived from the word for cattle. and then obviously other things that are slightly more convenient to carry around than cattle become that sort of universal equivalent. And there we are, we have money. So the general form of value, which is basically the raw form of money, results from the joint action of the whole world of commodities. So all these commodities that all translate each other's value in each other's relative value forms, they collectively create basically the concept and the reality of money, which might be cattle, or it might be gold, or it might be something else. And every new commodity must follow suit. So you enter the world of commodities and you have to accept basically the monopoly of one particular commodity to be the universal equivalent. Since the existence of commodities as values is purely social, this social existence can be expressed by the totality of their social relations alone, and consequently that the form of their value must be a socially recognized form. Again, the word form all over the place here, and again the emphasis that all these are societal concepts, social facts, if you like. And then in the last section, that's called the transition from the general form of value to the money form, that simply happens at the point when one particular commodity is socially identified simply through practice in society to be the universal equivalent. And the universal equivalent is basically just another word for money. That's what money is, established by social custom. Happens gradually, so this particular commodity gradually began to serve within varying limits as universal equivalent. And it becomes the money commodity. And then last sentence of this section, section 3, the simple commodity form is therefore the germ of the money form. So that is the end point of this argument in the third section of chapter 1, that develops the idea or the concept of money out of this simple commodity form. Which leaves us section 4, the famous chapter on the fetishism of commodities and the secret thereof, which will be treated in the next installment of the lecture. Thank you very much for your patience, and I'll see you as soon as I don't see you actually, you see me. You will get the rest of it as soon as I have recorded it. Thank you and good night.